I always have to. All right, it's this kind of thing where, highly informally here, we go our way. Okay, and we study these texts and the way we come across them. And there is so much extra tangential material that seems to be drawn in just in the fact of working in this way. So we enter a sacred space when we consider it, when we consider uh, the way of Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman built a world with words. Walt Whitman built a world with words. We call him genius because he offers us, in the world he builds with words, a new understanding of the energy in the word, the meaning creating energy within the word, building through other words, through vehicles within vehicles, building a world. And that's poetry, that's literature. It is a labor. It is a labor, and the labor is what makes it sacred. The labor is with something that is common to all human beings by virtue of their consciousness. The labor is this. The labor is there from the very emergence of consciousness. Let there be light, and there was. In the beginning was the Word. Before the Word there was no thing. Before the Word there was no thing. So all of this. And of course, they accrue many, 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 stray psychic energies. And they all become mixed into the language, and the language goes out amongst the people. And it appears and is used and takes many forms in many ways, some good, some bad. Like so many other things, like so many other living, unpredictable things that are in the cosmos. Unpredictable the forms that it might take, because operating within a certain parameter of freedom, guaranteed is a necessity for its creative unfoldment. Freedom, that's what we're talking about. So that's the first time I use that word, freedom. I'm using it in the imaginative sense. The freedom to allow the space for the creative form to emerge, the freedom to claim that space in consciousness, as say here is the boundary of what I will deem what I must say. To you, the unknown. To me, a necessity. I don't know it either, but it will cross a certain threshold in the, timeless way, and it will be a work of thought, a labor of thought, occurring in a mixed world, a purity of inspiration taking form in a mixed world. This, among many other things, makes Walt Whitman the original genius poet of democracy. And in democracy as the form in which he found himself amongst the people, and as a suggested form, suggested to him through the politics and the history of the nation in which he lived, of which his consciousness formed this very extremely creative conception of. So much so that you don't have to, like the sun, you don't have to look it straight in the eye. As a matter of fact, I recommend it not. And yet, it is the engenderer of all these forms, you see. And democracy is like that. Democracy is an analogy to something working within Whitman's own soul, you see. And I could talk about all the different ways he is a child of his times. And yet, at the same time, I want to pay some more attention to the text for certain reasons. Is Walt Whitman a child of these times? I think so, of course, but I have these observations. One observation is Walt Whitman's sense of the work of language in the world and the way the language came to fruition in that particular phase in the national life was in the form of journalism and newspapers and free speech pamphlets and things, and where thoughts were expressed and available to those who could read them. What limited it at those times was that not all that many could read. I mean, there were more that could not read than there are today, or it's a different kind of literacy issue happening, in today, poetically speaking. But back then, the newspapers, the books, and all this was there in wide circulation, and there were plenty of people who could read them, and plenty of times it was read to other people who listened to what was read to them and attended to it in the same way where they learned to attend to the word themselves. In the steeple house, in places like this, that was also places where the cognitive art of poetic formation and creativity in language and literature, forms of literature, preaching, these were practiced in the steeple house and on the village square by people from hither and yon, but also in the state houses, in the houses of legislation. In the houses of legislation, they were practicing words and speech, both bad and good. In the houses of judgment and the judicial sites, there was great and constant creative energy in the give and the take of the working out of the laws, as they're written down, you see. And then, of course, in the schools. Now, university education today, whatever it may be, is different from what it was back then, whatever, way it was. And I wonder sometimes where so many of the creative works, especially that Whitman exemplifies, the creative works written in like the crude vernacular of an individual with their own point of view, sophisticated and romantic in its literary conception, yes, but arising from a self-taught individual, an autodidact in many ways, or maybe just less official. Don't you think that the schoolhouses in the villages, in the village green and in the other places, and in the various forms of school, do not think that they were not full of creative educators? Even though there was no official kind of like career line by which it could be, identified as such in the way that it is today, well, back then it was for its own sake alone, for education alone. And sometimes being educated and having a tradition of inspired speech in words, philosophy, inspired religious writings, their spirits could be educated also, and their souls could too. And it's a unique conception of soul that is also our national common inheritance. And by national, I do not mean nationalism as it is now known. I mean, nation is just like a common unity, and finding that common inner unity is what Whitman is writing about in Democratic Vistas. And so, but let's also say it really quickly here. What is that makes these understandings worthwhile to attend to? One of the many ways its value becomes clear to us is when we attend to it through the speech and the process, the creative process that we come to know as sensitive readers to writers like Whitman. It opens us up to the past and to all the souls in the past, always, because this is writing that comes from the soul. And because of that, it will emerge in such a way, it has a way of emerging in such a way that it makes us conscious of the timeless values. This is the lyric feeling, right? This is the spiritual kind of quality in genius literature. Whitman brings this kind of consciousness to his consideration of democracy. But let's see where the things intersect. Okay? Democracy, the speech in common, right? The common one, the human one, the one whose value is in themselves, warranted by no institution or past history or exterior identity, limited only by the necessities of its own individual path of self-understanding and self-education. This is the seed kernel of the human singular individual in Whitman's democratic conception. Or is it, actually? Maybe for Whitman, he's going to be inclusive of everything that could ever be contradicted by any other thing. You see, he's so. This is also the nature of his poetic way of working. When we say inclusive, it's just like when Whitman says to the reader, "Whoever you are, holding me now in hand, I am not that which you think. I will take you on journeys that who knows if it's worth it or not," he will say. "Best be on your way then." But that's like, that's a persona too. And then Whitman is an earnest preacher, an earnest philosopher, and very, very creative. And as you come to get used to his prose style, I have found it to be just very, it's like working on a different muscle that I've always known it's there, a muscle in my mind to be able to kind of flow with this kind of flow, because there is like flow in it, and you attune your flow to that. Okay, so let's just see about this first. The entryway for me, for Whitman's understanding, ever creative, ever self-renewing, is through the doorway of reading as well as listening. Whitman created his world of words, and the only way we know it is reading it. The words build this thing in our minds, which leads to this, where we talk about the world that it made in us. But it was one tiny window, right? One tiny aperture. The reading eye, the listening eye, the contemplating eye, the intuitive reader. That's how poetry gets across. And that's how poetry comes down through the generations. It is passed from hand to hand and heart to heart in that way. It easily calcifies into cliches, but that's okay too, because cliches are fossils, and fossils are okay to look at, but also they're dense seed pods, so that, you can, if the eye be sincere, if the Quakers, with their notions and their teachings of like reading open to the spirit, one can begin to soften the exterior of any cliche and realize at one time, in one certain way, this means everything to someone at some point in time. And if you understand that to me is a key, to a historical poetic consciousness. Whitman inspires us to see things in this way, through our reading eye, simply, and then, our attending awareness of the literature, the energy of literature transcending the page. Because the page is not the original limitation of the literary art. Originally, it is the voice. The wave, voice, wave, vak, vacha, gods of speech and stillness, vibration. But then that other factor, the energy of meaning, that spark, and that's the spirit spark that jumps, and the soul is illuminated by that, you see. And it's distinctly literary. Whitman, says if what's going to keep this country together in its soul is its literature, as it is read in a creative way. The literature itself is very common. You could write it, I could write it. But the reader of the gifted artist, like Whitman, is gifted in turn through that tiny little opening, through the reading eye. So, I pledge allegiance to reading comprehension and to the republic of watchful listening for which it stands. One lit candle dripping many waxy layers, illuminating the darkness, superior to any curse. So there. You see, this is what I wanted to make a democratic type response to what I was learning in the pages of Whitman. And in so doing, I am invited by him and I invite your understanding to this also. The paragraphs in Democratic Vistas are wild, like Whitman's lines, are wild, and but it's they're in the paragraphs flow, like I say, in a really life-giving way, but the generalizations, the extravagances of abstract conception are so they're such a feature. That's it to me. It's like, oh, once again I come to grips with something in Whitman that is just like, wow, where does that come from? Anyway, so here's an example of that, as well as an idea which I think is worth attending to. In fact, see, he's even going to call it a fact. In fact, a new theory of literary composition for imaginative works of the very first class, especially for highest poems, is the sole course open to these states. Books are to be called for and supplied on the assumption that the process of reading is not a half-sleep, but in highest sense an exercise, a gymnast's struggle, that the reader is to do something for themselves, must be on the alert, must himself or herself construct indeed the poem, argument, history, metaphysical essay, the text furnishing the hints, the clue, the start or framework. Such a text is this. The text furnishing the hints, the clue, the start or framework. Not the book needs so much to be the complete thing, but the reader of the book does. That were to make a notion of supple and athletic minds, well-trained, intuitive, used to depend on themselves and not on a few coteries of writers. So you could almost say that there's, everything, of course, is capitulated and recapitulated again and again in these prose paragraphs, which is another thing about them. Whitman, as a prose writer, is like the Ouroboros. It's like the snake swooping down where its tail is among the stars and gobbling its own tail again and then undulating. And it's this like suppleness. It's one of the difficulties for me, is on almost like a physiological level, because I sympathize with it. I guess it's got me. And that's what I get to see when I am at my wit's end. But in Whitman, how does a snake be so subtle or slithering? It is never in any one shape. Just try to straighten a snake, and it would not be a snake anymore. And constantly, it's this way. And so that means to me lots of interstices. For me, physiologically, I can't get my mind out of that mask of sensation. Many, many interstices, many, many vertebra. And for every vertebra, there's nerves that are kind of open. All these ligatures are not armored. They cannot be, because then it would lose that kind of flexibility. So that, the ancients tell us symbolically, the snake sheds its own skin, and this is its rejuvenation. And so I take it to mean, like Whitman, these notions of self that are personas and masks, they come and go, and they're there, and they mean it to be there. And yet, there is that which is beyond appearance, you see. And that is where, and then he just kind of like, therefore my speculations are wild, because he's a daring thinker, right? And so, he invites us to kind of get to an understanding of all of this. So that's a little bit about reading comprehension, and what it means for consciousness in the world, but consciousness in the world in accordance with its unique nature. And there is that in the world which resists that, and so onward. And for that we need standard bearers, and for that we need standards, and for that we need the rattle and the hum, and the slow drift of syllables, carried by the ever-flexible snake, who may have exposed vertebra and be lacking in armor, but carries it anyway, carries all the more for the lack of for the lack of armor, is able to carry more of the energetic inspirations. These are electrical, atmospheric type metaphors. And that's another thing with Whitman. He embodies an understanding of some of his generalizations by offering to us the understanding of the atmosphere. It is like the atmosphere, he says, of democracy. He doesn't say democracy till about the third long paragraph, actually. And only then, and again after that, the word democracy is always kind of presented as being potential to a kind of a plus and minus sense, or a for or against sense, or a this or a that kind of sense, or an implemented thing, and sometimes a corrupted and tainted thing in all these different ways. He also, of democracy, I want to say another, to me, creative kind of addition he gives, at least to my understanding of democracy, when he takes the word sections. He speaks of democracy's sections. It's political sections, it's platforming and creation of social structures, institutional structures that have actual real bearing on people's lives, and boundary setting and time and space limitations, and the containment and the resolving of difficulties according to moral principles. You see, these are the kind of structures that are part of a living democracy that can only be understood by the reading consciousness, by the consciousness that understands the way words create worlds. And it makes it all the more imperative to judge righteously, so that the way may be obtained. And then the next moment he's talking about being inclusive, and he includes all. I mean, like Ganesh, the digester, the container, the beginner of the worlds, contains all the worlds in his belly, swirling like the nebula. We're inside it right now, of course, in which we live, move, and have our being. In and of itself, unknowable, but propagating form after form, many of which are creative analogies of what one is really looking for, which is that kind of like that spiritual essence of inspirational energy, so that the life can be lived which is connected with the reality of its own enteleki, the reality of its own, if I'm saying that word right, of its own inner necessity of unfoldment, of its own inner necessity of its calling, of its vocation meaning to be called beyond. Vocation, it's another manifestation of voice. The first syllable is that. Beyond the light of the campfire, where the others are, coming in and going in and out of the darkness of that, and bringing material to the people at the campfire who are attending to certain kind of like invisible things in common, which one called beyond finds out about. And they bring it back in these literary forms and other creative forms that emerge so as to show themselves as timeless, And so this is what's happening with Whitman always. Even Whitman himself, the form of Whitman as an inspired speaker, as a wounded healer, as a solitary singer. When he said, "Whoever touches this book touches a man," he was sort of joking. Look for me under your boot soles, I don't know. It's just he's very Hermes-like that way. That's what I can say about the persona of Whitman. But this is what we bring to it. But Hermes is a god of language, so he writes, "Our fundamental want today in the United States, with closest, amplest reference to present conditions and to the future, is of a class, and the clear idea of a class, of native authors, literatures far different, far higher in grade than any yet known, sacerdotal, modern, fit to cope with our occasions, lands permeating the whole mass of American mentality, taste, belief, breathing into it a new breath of life, giving it decision, affecting politics far more than the popular superficial suffrage, with results inside and underneath the elections of presidents or congresses, radiating, begetting appropriate teachers, schools, manners, and as its grandest result accomplishing what neither the schools nor the churches and their clergy have hitherto accomplished, and without which this nation will no more stand permanently soundly than a house will stand without a substratum. A religious and moral character beneath the political and productive and intellectual bases of these states. For know you not, dear earnest reader," and we know who that is now, at least. "For you know now not, dear earnest reader, that the people of our land may all read and write, and may all possess the right to vote, and yet the main things may be entirely lacking, and this to suggest them." Okay, and this is, Whitman, how are his times different than ours? Is he playing with fire with these kind of generalizations? I can hardly answer that fanciful argument, But Whitman, his gift comes in the milieu of American journalism, and in many, many forms that we kind of have heard of them now. I mean, they disappear from sight and all this, but we cannot. We can only imagine what it's like, the printed word on the page and the common tongue of the people and the common politics of the people, to hear the issues of the day discussed, and in some sense, albeit on some local level, to have a notion of input into that, and to contribute to that, as well as to do one's work as part of like a guild or a trade or a craft. See how that is? If Whitman is not a part of that, he comes from maybe only one or two generations out of that in a certain kind of sense. And that's a statement where one should hush unless one is going to say more about that. um, because Whitman is not okay. Whitman is privy to an understanding of the formation of this country, which precedes the American Revolution. Now, he was born after the American Revolution, of course. He was hoisted to his feet by what's his name, the Marquis Lafayette, when he was a mere lad, in Long Island when Marquis Lafayette was making a tour. He ran office errands for people. I can't remember if he said it was Aaron Burr, maybe, or Alexander Hamilton, maybe, who always had a kind word for him, and would give him an apple when he would bring by, some newspaper copy or something. Whitman is a journeyman newspaperman. Whitman as a school teacher. Whitman is involved in all of these close things. We have notions of them maybe only in a storybook way. But for Whitman now, this is a world where it precedes the American Revolution and everything that, comes with that, which he also understands in a very creative way. See, these are the strands woven, the long strands woven of Whitman's consciousness, of his intuitive consciousness. So he is not, burdened by this notion of our history, which might be, evolving from the end of the Second World War and the American Empire days, kind of, or Whitman's times, so formative, and so considered, so passé by so many, and yet let it be passé. Let it be as passé as it needs to be so as not to attract too much attention. Which brings me to the second thing that Whitman did not have to live through necessarily. He knew demagoguery. It was very common then. There were many a charismatic huckster selling ideas and thoughts, or selling a career based on the presentation of these things, as well as, all kinds of household items. But he knew that. But now, did he know, No, he did not know. He knew the way that this could work, though, the way that a lie can be heard around the world before truth gets out of bed and puts its boots on, But he doesn't know this current element, in our own times, and the challenge that it presents to contemplative attention to things that one can only know oneself, and yet one needs to learn how to verify that in ways that cannot be taught. Can't be taught by and from a world that is, what's the word? Symbiotic with exteriorized forms of mechanized, quantified consciousness. You see, everything, of course, that the mind, as Whitman wrote in a poem, there was a child went forth, and everything that it touched, it became. Yes, everything conditions the mind as it passes through. The mind learns how it is conditioned through experience and understanding and insight and inspiration. It can't hardly be taught, but the conditions for its learning in a society can be fostered, which is the purpose of educational institutions like schools and things, you see. And Whitman would understand a statement like that, but he would not. Well, he did not have the digitalized, processed, technological onslaught. And I think he would be flabbergasted at, what, have they no memory lane to speak of? Are these the ones who will be guardians of the legacy of such creative thinkers as myself? And they'll believe anything. He would be flabbergasted by that. But then again, flabbergastesque is one of his change of garments. Agony is one of his changes of garments. Anyway, so I just wanted to say that in general terms, what we can say about Whitman, and yet, which actually makes us able to attend to some of his insights with a bit more almost poignance, that piercing clarity, which can sometimes bring in its own form of light. Looking through a pinprick, after all, isn't the reading eye hardly but a pinprick in the notions of what consciousness truly is and the vastness of consciousness, which is also those transcendental ideas, very much inspire Whitman every step of the way, So much so that, a lot of people, it was just too much, too many butterflies, too many blossoms. They didn't understand that. No, that's okay. Those are notions of style. Whitman's style is so strong that, and that's lucky fate for that kind of artist, because then the reactions against it kind of feed the energy of it almost. I don't see Whitman as being like, tough in that sense, but I see him very much as being, well, he knew what to be indifferent to, and which inspired him. But he also knew the pain, and here's to sometimes what I can sense, many a tearing pain, he says it is. I can't remember the specific word he used, but he refers to it more than once, being, under the stars and looking up. He's under the stars, but he's looking up after he's been, I think, kind of deeply involved in some kind of close, concentrated kind of, focused consistency of attention, maybe involving, painful memories, or maybe involving awareness of certain kind of artistic frustrations or social frustrations. And yet what brings the ink to flowing is the awareness of the proper place of these frustrations in the grand scheme of things, which inspires him with hope, which is transmitted almost directly through the ink of his writing pen, and then even more directly through the electrical magnetism of attention through our eye, you see, as readers in the way that he has taught us, you see. So, here's a little bit more on that, I guess. Few are aware how the great literature penetrates all, giving hue to all, shapes, aggregates, and individuals, and after subtle ways with irresistible power constructs, sustains, demolishes, at will. Why tower in reminiscence above all the nations of the earth two special lands, petty in themselves, yet inexpressibly gigantic, beautiful columnar? Immortal Judah lives, and Greece immortal lives in a couple of poems. He learned how to be extravagant from 19th century journalism, but when he says it in this vatacentric way, we think, oh, aren't you daring? At first. And that's the stylistic kind of like thing, almost it's like polarizing. But then, no, it's informal. It's like a kid would talk, actually. Simply, it is. I mean, and it's also like it's a vernacular move, except he's definitely writing it. Like a comedian with a certain kind of inflection will bring, the line of thought, however staccato it is if you're telling jokes, one after the other. But we'll bring the kind of like the clarity and then step away from it to kind of increase the drama, of what it may or may not be about, as in like, oh, I know where this is going or not. That's a crude way that one feels it. But as one becomes more attuned to the aesthetic experience that Whitman helps us to conceive of, we find that it's an art of time, isn't it now? Now, we could talk about suspense. We could talk about guessing games. I know where this is going. We could talk about the leap to paraphrase. See, all these kind of things, the people in the world, I don't know if they ever get to practice that, the way that information is dumped and the rate of speed, that it comes and goes. And then the persona, I think this is where it conditions us. It's nothing so magical. It's just like more like, oh, the way that the quality of attention becomes part of the way one presents oneself to other people, and the way that they establish a common world together, you see. Um, Now, that's just an illustration of how it could be. If I was a satirist, I could like create, characters out of that. But that's not the thing. It's more like I'm doing this in the style of Whitman. I'm presenting kind of like suggestions as metaphors and generalizations, which can be open doors sometimes, and closed doors other times, but you can't tell the difference between an open and a closed door unless you have them, open doors and closed doors. If there's a closed door, knock and it shall be opened. You see, it tunes right in terms of vernacular, to that kind of sacred literature. Sacred in a sense that Whitman is free of the encumbrance of being held back by, as we should be, as is possible for us. Whitman freely speaks of, we heard him use the word sacerdotal, the literature that he speaks of, the teachers that he speaks of, the forms of understanding, basically, is what it comes to, that he is suggesting and intimating, and sometimes describing, and sometimes presenting. These things arise from an understanding of, like, well, as he put it, the priest departs, the literatus arrives. The poet's creative imagination will understand the truth of all forms of idea. And as such, so much impassioned human speech and pain and insight and understanding has been affixed through human attention span magnetism to a finite body of syllables. A finite and infinite body of syllables. Also a finite as well as and out of and originating from a finite and a finite and yet eternal, bounded and yet ever conceiving forth out of itself like sourdough starter. I'm talking about myth. I'm talking about myth and mythic symbols. That's what I'm talking about. And that's prior to religions and things. And so the poet's eye, is, among so many other things, it's an eye that opens directly onto an understanding of myth, so that it is not subject to the allure of glittering advancements of temporal powers, And it's not caught up in that kind of thing. It is not hoodwinked. It is not inappropriately persuaded by images of power, etc. And so that simply lives, and it might seem like there's an analogy to that in political life, but that's a section of this mosaic of insight that Whitman is offering. The intersection of democracy, the intersection is this notion of the singularity of the common. And there's no need to carry over hatreds and animosities from generation to generation, passed down like family heirlooms. Now, he might be talking this way about medieval feuds. Feudalism is a word he loves to talk about as kind of a counterweight to democracy, and that's cool. I kind of take license a little bit from him to consider, put it this way. Poisons are passed down as heirlooms in very common speech, so that personas can pick them up and magnify themselves for purposes of their own and misdirect others. The blind leading the blind, the morally blind leading the morally blind. Human consciousness is subject to this. Whitman explicitly says so in many, many paragraphs. He says this essay is offered to one whose mind is full of the possibilities of democracy as well as the obstacles to intelligence that are there. And it is a very common pain to all, the intelligent as well as the not so intelligent. And it has only a limited political meaning. It has a poetic meaning like now. It is food for thought, food for the thought of individuals, readers, and that kind of transmission, you know. Sacred literature. Now the door is open. We needn't worry if someone calls us some nasty name like religious. No, that I'm exaggerating, perhaps, but I'm young. I want to find her. Whitman's mother was a Quaker, or they were of Quaker stock. Whitman's father too. Whitman, I mentioned they were great historical figures locally back then. Oh, that too, actually. Mass media, early on, in a certain sense, has reduced that, for so many, mass society has reduced that. But the very notion that a local character, that you see on the street sometimes is a noteworthy person in the larger consciousness, and so he saw, some of these people like Elias Hicks. How's that for a famous person that Whitman knew when he was a kid? He didn't know him. He did not converse with him, but he heard him speak. Elias Hicks was a great American Quaker preacher. And he too, in a big way, and this was awe to Whitman. Whitman knew this before he was a poet. Whitman knew this as a child. Elias Hicks. His father would walk in and put down a load of firewood. Mother, get ready. Elias Hicks speaks tonight. And one night they let Walt go with them. I think he was 9 years old. And so Walt Whitman heard Elias Hicks, and he, what was it now? Something to the effect of, he starts off after a long silence, you see, because this is Quaker. This is the Quaker inner light. You speak when you are moved. But Elias Hicks had that gift, and a long silence. Painfully long, I think. Actually, Whitman wrote that. And then Elias Hicks, with his piercing eyes, Whitman always said, and yet a very plain and dour looking kind of face. But I can imagine there's a really a very sensitive lithograph or drawing of him in Whitman's November Boughs, a portrait in ink, a lithograph, I don't know what they call them, a drawing maybe of Elias Hicks. And it's a face to look through. It's a persona. And then Whitman writes about Elias Hicks later on. Whitman, who's to say but that Whitman's best writings are writings like this, certainly for me they're just what I'm looking for in a certain sense. I don't know how I can say that. I want to be able to say that because it frees a certain energy in my own mind of what poetry can be. Anyway, he tells the story. Elias Hicks opened his mouth and said something to the effect of, man was created to glorify God or to praise God, or the world is created as the handiwork of God. And then Whitman, who was only 8 or 9, he said, I didn't retain anything more than that. Whitman says something to that effect. But his mother helped him along, because his mother was like someone who did pay attention as her simple way. And so this was this deep inspiration. And so though his mother did not, I don't know, or anyone in his family appreciate Walt Whitman as the literary artist that we know him now, that didn't speak to them. He was their, I guess that's only natural, and yet at the same time, Whitman finds a way, for us, if we want to see it, for him to explain to us, okay, yeah, they didn't have anything to do with me becoming Walt Whitman. Or did they? Because this is what I learned. This is what I learned from them. They were his teachers, of course. And then his gift to make it available to us through his gift, through his literary gift, to tell us about Elias Hicks. And yes, Whitman was a kid and he didn't quite remember, but he was able to dialogue with his mother, you might say, and get a sense of what the whole Quaker spirituality was, so much so that it becomes available to us like an atmosphere. off the richness, of Whitman's writings. So he speaks of Elias Hicks, but here's someone else he speaks of. And this is, we begin to touch upon his notions of the sacredness of the common and the paradox. When we speak of greatness, it's not feudal. Greatness is not external in the powerfulness of personalities and power and fame. It is not even there in the attendance to the sacred call of aristocratic duty or hereditary obligation. See, that's, he will fall back so that he can sally forth against notions of feudalism in certain kinds of romantic literature. And that's actually, to me, I've discovered at this time, that seems one dated part of Whitman, or that's him with his own kind of thing. I do not experience it that way in my daily life. I don't think of that as a stricture, that kind of stylization. But for him, it was something he was very much reacting against, because he wanted to go for that crude, rude American tongue, which he did, But here we come, though, to a greater level of humility, and where, poetry can be so common, the energy of it can be so free for that. And we can kind of get in touch with it when we read this. In Democratic Vistas, it breaks into this paragraph where he writes, "My dear mother once described to me a resplendent person down on Long Island, whom she knew in early days. She was known by the name of the Peacemaker. She was well toward 80 years old, of happy and sunny temperament, had always lived on a farm, and was very neighborly, sensible, and discreet, an invariable and welcomed favorite, especially with young married women. She had numerous children and grandchildren. She had come to be a tacitly agreed upon domestic regulator, judge, settler of difficulties, shepherdess, and reconciler in the land. She was a sight to draw near and look upon, and her large figure, her profuse snow-white hair, uncoiffed by any headdress or cap, dark eyes, clear complexion, sweet breath, and peculiar personal magnetism." So, the Peacemaker, that's all the names she needs to have. And is that not immortality? Is that not fame? But of a creative kind. Is that not the chain down which the thought of the ages continues to be transmitted in masterpieces of literature, such as Whitman's Democratic Vistas? Oh, I just can't believe it. I can't believe it. Believe, belief. Don't you know, belief is something, belief is a lovely word. It's a powerful and dramatic word. It moves, though, in a world where there is something more original than that. There was a beggar in the village who had been blind from birth. And one day, Isa bin Maryam and some of his disciples walked by. Isa bin Maryam, Jesus, son of Mary. And the disciples said, him over there, is he blind because of his parents' sin or because of his own? And Isa bin Maryam, Jesus, son of Mary, said, he is not blind for any of these reasons. He is blind so that the handiwork of the divine may be displayed in him. And the next thing, it seemed, I can't remember if Isa bin Maryam said anything to him at that time. But here's what he did. He spit into clay, and he made mud, and he put the mud on the blind man's eyes. And then he said, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam." And this blind boy said, "So I washed in the pool of Siloam, and I could see." This he said to his neighbors later on. And at that time, his neighbors walking by said, "Hey, is that the one who used to be blind? Is that the blind beggar? That boy, did he used to be blind? Is that him?" And another one said, No, that is not him. That is someone who looks like him, because he is blind, he cannot see. This one can see, so it is someone who looks like him. And then, they asked him, "Are you him?" And he said, "Yes." And he said to his neighbors, or they asked him, it's important, this is a dialogue. They asked him, "How did you come to see?" A man named Jesus, almost like he was saying, I caught that, made mud and he put it on my eyes. He told me to go wash in the pool of Siloam. I washed and I could see. And, they were amazed. And of course they went and told the Pharisees. Now, our notions of the ways religious power is shared and the conflicts that can arise and the notions of law, if I had time, we could talk about law in Whitman. In Whitman's conception of law is just so dynamic and so Hegelian and so just beautiful and glowing. Very much. You feel that Quaker spirit there, but everything else, Anyway. The Pharisees, they were the legalists, and they were very concerned, actually. I think it was on the Sabbath that this happened. And the Pharisees were the next ones. I guess the neighbors told on him. I don't want to spread gossip or something. But the Pharisees came and they said, "Were you the one who was blind?" "Yes, I was the one who was blind." "How do you see?" "The one named Jesus made mud. I put it on my eyes. He told me to wash in the pool of Siloam, and I could see." They said, "This is on the Sabbath. This is not a righteous thing." And then, so therefore you can't see. So they might have said stuff like that, but I can see. And they said, well, this was something done on the Sabbath. So then actually they had to ask themselves, and that too created division amongst them, which they only resolved through these certain set kind of legal procedural arguments, and in that way they contributed to the community. This is, you could look at this in a very judicial way, but the Pharisees said, some said, well, it can't be because he worked on the Sabbath, so it's bad. It is not of God because it's a breaking of the Sabbath law. And then others said, but if it can't be a breaking of the law because it eased suffering. I don't know if they ever said ease suffering. Of course they said ease suffering, but the scriptures say he healed the sick. The scriptures have tended to say that, but I want to, that's a whole other thing. But he did that. So it has to be of God. It has to be good. And so there was division amongst them. So the Pharisees came to see the parents of the blind boy. And they said, was your son born blind? Yes, he was. Can he see now? Yes, he can see. How did he come to see? And the parents said, ask him. They stepped back. He is of age. And so for a second time, the Pharisees came to him. And the Pharisees said, it is not of God that this happened, or something to that effect, they said, you said he was a prophet back then. How could he be a prophet if he healed you, if he broke the Sabbath law? And he said, the one who was blind who could see said basically, I do not know about the law. I do not know about, I only know this. I was blind, now I see. So when I say that there is something prior to belief that is very much a part of sacred understanding, that's kind of what I mean. The workings out of these positions and things are necessary, I suppose, on some level of being, but the actual fact of it is incontrovertible, and yet somehow requires a lifetime after lifetime to understand. And this is kind of that process. And but he was threatened, I think, with expulsion. I take the story from the Gospel of John, which was written 100 years later, and there was more of a doctrinal and sectarian definition that began to gather around the early birth, of the people of the steeple house, we can just say fancifully. And the very notion back in the immediate times of Isa bin Maryam, Jesus, son of Mary, there was no notion of expulsion of someone because they would not be a different religion, but there was controversy about this particular individual and the things that he was doing. And a great deal of it was political, and I don't know if we'll ever get to the inner meaning of all that. But we can get to this. He was expelled. He mocked them a little bit, though. He said, "You asked me it twice, do you want to be his disciple? You go and be his disciple." Ooh, that offended the Pharisees. "We are disciples of Moses. Moses is of God. This one broke the Sabbath law. He's not of God." And then he said, speaking truth to power, which comes to us, by the way, from the Quakers and their understanding of it. Ooh, if you read it intuitively, you will feel all kinds of different nuances that were possible at that time. It's been sort of appropriated by our own times in its tones, of course, and what the tones seem to mean, But there's still is a necessity because, of course, there's plenty of speakers of truth to power for real, and plenty of listeners to great power, also, But he. Later on, the issue of belief does come up. He said to them, "One who is of God listens to God and does the work of God." And that's what he said to them when they said assertively and aggressively that they were the disciples of Moses. These are religious arguments there. But you can add a little bit to it because he was blind and now he sees. And then he went out, and this is important to some aspect of the story. This is important in Whitman. It's the person. He went out, and sometime later, on the street, he was standing before a stranger he could see, and the stranger said, "Do you believe in the human one?" And he said, "I want to believe." And he said, "He is standing before you." And the blind man saw the one who gave him the mud and told him the command to wash in the pool of Siloam so that the waters of sight could give him understanding of the world in this way. And he saw the one who worked this, and he believed, and he believed. Then there was the belief. In the beginning was the light, you see. And the world comprehended it not. See, a lot of this is coming from the Gospel of John, which has always inspired deep meditation and free meditation, you see. That's just a little bit. I know the time has come for me to, to lift my pen off the page, And I surely appreciate, your attention, to the flowing of this thought. And so I thank you for your heroic listening, and so long for now.